In my last video, I touched upon the fact that I was struggling with the current gaming sphere. I felt almost defeated in a lot of what's coming out, what's been announced, and what's presented because a lot of it kind of just looks the same as it did nearly a decade ago. A lot of buzzwords and marketing words being thrown around like ray tracing, which doesn't make a damn bit of difference as to whether or not a game is fun to play. But I digress. But games at a fundamental level have not evolved past their most basic gameplay elements. It's made me reflective of the games of old, some with lesser tech, which were able to accomplish much more interesting and innovative things, and its approach to game design, which most modern-day developers have kind of seemingly lost the purpose or the intent for, which was, at the end of the day, the game has to be fun for the player playing it. Gone are the days where that was seemingly a priority. Now it's all about getting the game to look as good as you possibly can and shipping it out the door, mass market appeal, making games that are the trend, and doing the same kind of game archetype over and over and over ad nauseum, making minimal changes for broad mass appeal to create the moolah that you need to sustain in a very inflated and just insane development cycle. And not only is it just about looks, but it's also about nickel and diming the consumer to the point where it is just obnoxious. You don't even own the games you play anymore. You own the license to be able to play the game. But once the developer or the publisher decides to cut that license, you've just paid all this money up front for what's essentially an investment, and you don't know whether or not that investment is going to pull through, because at any point in time they can just kind of pull the rug underneath you. Because I don't understand how AAA games can even afford to make the games at the costs that they're making them, because it's just astronomical at this point. But it never needed to get to that point. Now we have developers who get somewhat of a modicum of success, and they determine that they know all because they've made a bunch of money, and now they're going to force things upon the gamers whether or not they actually want it or not, because in their mind they'll just say, well, they don't know they'll want it, but we'll make them want it, which is just so antithetical thinking. I cannot comprehend that level of ego. Developers who get a modicum of success and all of a sudden say that gamers are idiots and we don't know what we want, even though clearly say what we want, but they say that, oh, because gamers don't know what they want, we're gonna make them know what they want. We're just gonna force things on them that we know they hate, but we're gonna get them to like them if we just try hard enough. Brute forcing anything in life is kind of the worst way to go about it. So no, no, that is ego talking. That is just banal, nonsensical ego. And don't get me wrong, there are some bad faith actors in the gaming sphere. Gamers are not all that smart, at least most of them. Some are kind of intelligent, but for the most part, most people don't really know what the hell they're saying. So there is a level of sympathy I do have with the developers, but to dismiss all of the criticism that comes their way as a blanket statement, gamers are idiots, they don't know what the hell they're talking about, is asinine. Furthermore, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have the fan base that are just toxic positivity to the absolute moon. That's not helpful to anyone creating these echo chambers where criticism can't be had, or if there is criticism, oh, you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about, this game is great, because the idea that someone can't enjoy something that you did just is impossible. What reality are we living in? But that is also another discussion for another day. I want to talk about a game that for the last decade has made a vast impression on me. A game that I miss all the time, and I would go semi-regularly to my friends also played this game, and would mention some old memories to trigger just kind of a nostalgic feeling, to see if they felt the same way that I did about the game, about the memories that we shared on the battlefields that we played on. I want to talk about a game that at the time that it came out was a game that was out of time. Had it come out a few years later, it would have been massively successful, or at least much more accepted than it was when it did release. I want to talk about a game that is misplaced, one with concepts and ideas that should have taken it farther, a game that deserved better. But first, I'm going to talk about another game. The year is 2007, and the PlayStation 3 is brand spanking new. Online games are becoming much more prevalent and important to the console's ecosystems, as the end of the PlayStation 2's lifecycle introduced online gaming, but by the beginning of the PlayStation 3 had fully embraced it. One game, though, was a standout for a multitude of reasons. That game would be called Warhawk. A somewhat spiritual successor to the game of the same name from the PlayStation 1, Warhawk 2007 was a vastly different beast and amongst one of the premier multiplayer experiences Sony could offer off-rip. Developed by Incognito Entertainment with figurehead Dylan Jobe at the helm, Warhawk, for lack of a better term, was, well, Warhawk was the shit. A truly special game, and if you don't believe me, just take a couple of seconds and listen to the amazing menu music. Anyone who has played this game for even a fraction of a minute already knows this, but to those who are undoctrinated, let me just show you a couple of snippets of gameplay so that you can maybe comprehend and understand. At the time, there wasn't anything like Warhawk. This was truly a unique experience. The closest you could maybe say was Halo, but it wasn't this insane. 32-player lobbies with this much mayhem was unheard of in 2007, especially since Halo 3, the last Halo to release at the time this game came out, only had 16 players as a cap. This was a game where you could fight on the ground infantry style, get on a jeep and do drive-bys with a turret that's mounted on the back, get in a tank and plague hell with volleys, or more importantly and true to the name of the game, take to the skies in a Warhawk for some of the most exhilarating dogfights you can muster in all of the unique maps across the game. It was also extremely consumer friendly. If you didn't have access to the full game via a purchase, you could just download the demo for said game and just play a multiplayer game for free non-stop. It wouldn't let you just play one game, it would let you play for as long as you had access to that demo, with a reminder to buy the full game if you enjoyed it. Sure, you wouldn't have access to all the maps and game modes, but you essentially got to play the game for free. It was also the very first downloadable game on the PlayStation Network, and I mean, for good reason. The game was just awesome. I really can't sing any more praises for this game. Not only just that, right, but physical copies of the game at GameStop came bundled with Bluetooth headsets for roughly about $40. That's the game and the headset for $40. Really wanting you to get involved in the game's community and strategies for game modes. Sure, the headset it came with wasn't the greatest gaming headset in the world, but at the time, not that many people had headsets, let alone Bluetooth headsets, since the console was brand new. This was a bargain. Oh, and just for fun and bragging rights about how much Warhawk was the shit, in case you were doubting me, say you had a party around 2007 and you had 4 cousins come over and they all wanted to play Warhawk. They see you playing this awesome game. Well, you could be the cool cousin and just be like, alright, pull up 3 remotes, let's have at it. Because this game also had 4-player split-screen co-op, one of the rarest games to do this. Meaning you can take your annoying-ass cousins online to get absolutely stomped out. The game truly had it all, from great balancing to great gameplay, amazing soundtrack, it doesn't get enough credit, developers who cared and were passionate and fostered their community, DLC to add further fun to the game and to prevent it from going stale, trophy support, which was added in 2008. Eventually, however, Father Time is undefeated and it passes us all. As more and more games got released, so waned Warhawk's popularity. While its community stayed strong and servers were indeed active, by 2010 it was no longer the belle of the ball, despite nothing really coming close that even remotely looked like Warhawk, or what the game had to offer from a gameplay perspective. Incognito Entertainment at that point had dissolved and become defunct a year prior in 2009, meaning that any future support for Warhawk was over. The dream, while not quite dead, was on life support, and at this point with only the community keeping it alive. But then there were some rumblings around 2011. A game was announced. Lightbox Interactive was a developer that came out of nowhere, and they were now the studio in charge of providing not a sequel per se, but another spiritual successor to Warhawk. The studio was composed of many of the veterans from Incognito Entertainment, including the now president of Lightbox Interactive, Dylan Job. The game was called Starhawk. This game deserved so much better. It released in May of 2012 after having a brief beta period in 2011. I was all in on Starhawk from the moment I got into beta, and I got a few friends on board too. They too were hyped as hell for final release, as the game had a ton of promise, boasting new features while still somewhat staying true to what made Warhawk incredibly fun. Starhawk should have been a massive success. The game, though, for whatever reason, didn't quite catch fire the way that Warhawk did, and I still to this day don't quite understand that. I do in some aspects, but I don't for some others. For some reason or another, the community for Warhawk really just wanted Warhawk 2, and because Starhawk was vastly different from environments to tones to atmosphere despite being almost identical in gameplay, it was almost as if a revolt from the Warhawk community transpired. Yes, the game ditched the sci-fi, almost Star Wars in nature aesthetic it had going on in Warhawk for a more space cowboys oriented theme in Starhawk, but I personally don't hate that. Would I have preferred an aesthetic similar to Warhawk? Yeah, probably. But did I hate the new direction Starhawk went forward with? Not really. I think personally the only problem I truly had with it was the direction that the story for the game went. That's right, while Warhawk was exclusively a multiplayer game, Starhawk felt the need to undo the mistake that Warhawk made in not including something for single-player connoisseurs. And look, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that Starhawk's single-player campaign was the best thing since sliced bread, because it never was. I think my problem with it, outside of it being a blatant tutorialization and onboarding for new players to get familiar with its new mechanics, which we'll kind of touch on in a little bit, was the fact that the entire story is all about scavenging this energy rifts like you're out there drilling for oil. Comparing that to the two warring factions in Warhawk, which you don't get much story for, and the story that's being told in the terrains and the maps you're playing in, Starhawk is just supremely uninteresting by comparison. So yes, I can understand that, drifting those away who prefer what was had before, but from a gameplay perspective, I never truly got it. Starhawk, in my personal opinion, improved on many of the factors that Warhawk had initially laid the foundation to. Warhawk, if we want to be honest with ourselves, and that includes you, Warhawk community, not the perfect game that you think it is, was very arcadey in its nature, and that's not inherently a bad thing. Go saying that I said it was, because I said it's not, and if you start putting words in my mouth, me and you are going to have problems there, Buster, and I don't think you want to do that. Let's start being careful with it, yeah? Anyway, in Warhawk, when you would get into gunfights, the only weapon that you could manually aim was the sniper rifle. That's the only gun that you could actually zoom in and take precision aim with. Any other gun in the game would usually rely on the heavy lock onto the enemy auto-aim system that was inherent in that game. That gunfights weren't always the most dynamic thing in the world, which meant that gunfights kind of played out like this. A guy starts shooting at you, grenade throw, swap out to the rocket launcher, boom, dead. It was kind of ugh. Starhawk, by comparison, became a true third-person shooter, now allowing you to take precision aim with all weapons, not just the sniper rifle, but it also maintained the pace that Warhawk had to a certain extent. It was a little slower and somewhat a little bit clunkier because of the new mechanics, but the game still played relatively the same. You could still swap out to another gun to win you the gunfight, or lob a grenade, because that was always an option too. But now, aiming actually matters. It's not just, we're gonna snap onto you and just... Your aim now matters, and it isn't just a game of just shooting a few rounds and then throwing out a grenade for a quick kill. That still happens, but is not as prevalent as it was in Warhawk. And while not on by default, you can change the settings in the menus to have the Hawks fly exactly the same way they did in Warhawk, because they do feel different upon playing this game and not changing it with the default settings intact. It wasn't all improvements, however. Starhawk did have split-screen multiplayer like Warhawk for those who wanted to play the game at home, but it was capped at 2 players compared to Warhawk's 4. Starhawk also made one of the more controversial changes by making the Hawks bipedal, essentially turning it from a land-to-air vehicle in seconds. Hawks were already incredibly strong, but a good Hawk player could dominate matches, leading to most of the players that I knew opting to play the game modes that turned the Hawks off, like Ground Pounder, which enabled all vehicles minus those that fly to avoid the frustration of constantly being carpet bombed and torpedoed. Game modes from Warhawk did make their return, but a few new ones were included in Starhawk: Capture and Hold and Assault and Defend, and now a dedicated co-op mission, which essentially was a horde mode defense with the build and battle system included. Oh yeah, that thing that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Yeah, we'll wait for that. All of these could be customized to your liking if you wanted to set up your own servers. Well, you know, back when the game could allow you to make your own servers, but you can make the games last longer for XP grinding, or you can make them shorter for more faster paced and intense battles if you were trophy hunting, because you did have to get like 100 games won or whatever the hell it was. I still am missing one. Man, that sucks. But the biggest differing factor between the two games, however, was one major important mechanic, and I kinda spoiled it, but let's talk about it. In Warhawk, maps were meticulously designed. Designated areas for infantry troops to poke shots from, turrets to man and gun for those pesky strafing runs, bridges designed for vehicles, weapons all over the air for select spots for hawks, you name it, and the whole 9 yards, it's there. Starhawk did none of these things outside of basic map layouts and air weapon placements. Multiplayer maps were wide open terrains. Why would they do that, you ask? Because Starhawk allowed you, the players, to decide how the map would be. The build and battle system was this game's grandest gameplay mechanic, and kind of its Achilles heel at the same time, but hey. The mechanic added something of a real-time strategy element to the game, allowing players to essentially build their own bases, turrets, vehicle depots, bunkers. I mean, the list goes on, and that list changes dependent on the game mode, which we touched on. The map was a sandbox, and you influence how it'll be played in. This mechanic fundamentally changed how the game was played, as now this was yet another factor you had to consider in matches. You could sneak through enemy terrain and set up a spawn beacon close to the enemy team's base to launch a surprise attack, or build yourself a fortress of walls and turrets to protect the flag and capture the flag games from being easily captured. It was ultimately a test of coordination between you and your teammates, because you only had 32 slots to build on for both teams, totaling at 64. This mechanic would somewhat become a bone of contention with some Warhawk vets, because it allowed much more passive play to be prevalent and almost rewarded, especially during the earlier days of the game's release, where things like turrets, especially an army of turrets, made it difficult for anyone to break through defenses without the right skills or equipment equipped. And yeah, the game also had somewhat of a perk system with different abilities, some as simple as spawning with a particular weapon, others that granted you the ability to generate Rift, which is the game's in-game currency that allows you to build said objects in the map regardless of where you are at a cost. Staying in your base allows you to gain it, but at a much slower rate, as opposed to getting kills or farming the energy Rift barrels that are out in the terrain. The build and battle system was a truly innovative system, and one that still to this day does not get its appropriate amount of flowers. And if you're thinking to yourself, that mechanic looks somewhat familiar, well,
Fat Face Cowboy.
That's right. Solid Snake from Metal Gear Solid from Fortnite. No, that's just a shit joke. Anyway, that's right, the #1 game in the world, Fortnite. That game had one of its most pivotal mechanics lifted straight from Starhawk. And if you're gonna sit there and tell me that you can't see the direct line from the build and battle system from Starhawk to the building system in Fortnite, you are either purposefully ignorant or obscenely obtuse. It's one or the other, or maybe both. But the fact of the matter is that had Sony not set this game up to fail, well, certainly did, maybe, just maybe, with a little bit more support, Starhawk might have gotten off the ground a little bit more, because look at the things that system did for Fortnite. It put it on the map, and it made it completely different and stand out from virtually every other game that was coming out at that same time that also just happened to be trendy and have a battle royale shipped in it for absolutely no reason. And look, don't misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that Starhawk could have become the next Fortnite. Not even close. It's a first-party game, first and foremost. It wouldn't have gotten nearly as much support, like a game that's a multi-platform. But what I'm saying is that had Sony not set that game up to fail, Starhawk could have gone on to prosper and be much more than what it was, which is essentially just a footnote in the PlayStation history. And maybe, just maybe, Starhawk would have gone on to prosper more than it did and honestly deserved. Oh, but JC, what do you mean Sony set it up to fail? Well, I'll tell ya, eager viewer. Starhawk, despite being the successor to one of Sony's most pivotal multiplayer games upon its PS3 launch, did not get the love or care it deserved from Sony, no matter how much revisionist history would say otherwise. Firstly, the game was hardly marketed. A few TV spots on the Sci-Fi Channel and some YouTube ads are all I can really remember seeing for this game. I did most of the work advertising this game through word of mouth, which is nothing compared to how some games would be marketed even a year before this. Does anyone remember Uncharted 3 with their weird-ass subway tie-in? Yeah, Sandwich Drake? good grief. Maybe even a fraction of that marketing money could have helped Starhawk to find more of an audience, instead of just sticking Emmett Graves, the main character of the game, inside a PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, another game that wouldn't go on to sell well. Sony did the bare minimum to let people know this game even existed, and they almost cannibalized their game with their attempts to get people to try and check it out. Now, I mentioned earlier before that I was a lucky guy who got into early access beta for being a Warhawk veteran. I was amongst an elite few, but there were also other means of getting into the Starhawk beta at a later time, and that was possible if you had bought copies of Uncharted 3. Uncharted 3, by the way, also had its own multiplayer component. So this beta is now attempting to siphon players away from a Naughty Dog game that is next to nigh impossible to try and do, to play a game that they have no idea about? That makes no sense to me. I understand using a game with more notoriety to get people to check out a lesser known game. That part makes sense to me, but not when that game also has a third-person shooter multiplayer component with its own dedicated fan base. I would know this because I was deeply entrenched in those Uncharted 3 multiplayer games. Some of my very first YouTube videos were Uncharted 3 multiplayer games, so I have first-hand knowledge and an account from what was happening with that community in real time when it came to Starhawk. And while some definitely did try the beta out, and it was indeed populated, a lot of the Uncharted players simply tried it and didn't care, and then went right back to Uncharted 3, or they didn't even bother checking it out at all. Considering the game's multiplayer was the main attraction for Starhawk, you would have thought Sony would have made an effort to also incentivize players to play the game with something of a tournament, as Starhawk would have made an amazing spectator game alongside a fun game to play. But there was only one major tournament that existed for Starhawk throughout its life cycle, which was an MLG tourney for a cash prize of around $20,000. A good chunk of change. But this was the extent of the effort that Sony was willing to go for. But outside of a PlayStation blog post that had extremely low visibility, I didn't even know this tournament was going on, and I was playing this game every day back in 2012. Where was the promotion for this? I guess it didn't matter, because at this point in time, Sony knew that Starhawk was done for, and the tourney was considered somewhat of a last hurrah of sorts for the competitive scene of this game. The game would go on to underperform and not sell as much as Sony would hope for. 5 months after the game was released, Lightbox Interactive would shutter, as Sony would go on to opt to not further collaborate with them, forcing layoffs to roughly 90% of Lightbox's staff, or 24 out of their 30 employees gone. It was a brutal blow to the company that it would never recover from, and effectively killed the game pretty much in its infancy. Support for Starhawk was now over, and the final nail in the coffin for Starhawk being a late 2012 release meant that in only a handful of months, the PlayStation 4 would be announced. The game simply came out far too late in the PS3's life cycle to make any kind of dent alongside all the other bullets it caught on its way to release. No one was going to look back at Starhawk when the future was imminent. Its few remaining diehards were going to jump ship, and jump ship soon. A year and a half of a life cycle is not a terrible amount of time, especially on the cusp of the new generation. Had the game been a launch PS4 title, which again would have been a year and a half after the game initially launched, we probably would have been talking about a different story here. But that honor would go on to another game and another franchise that Sony also neglects. A franchise by the name of Killzone, an all-but-forgotten series with another abandoned fan base. And stuff like this really drives me to the moon. While Warhawk would see a community-driven revival due to some people who are much more cleverer than I am, Starhawk, whose server management and entire game was now transferred over and managed by Sony Santa Monica, has not seen such luck. The game remains dead on the multiplayer front to this day, and while local LAN games and even couch co-op do remain possible, the large-scale battles the game used to have and was mostly proud for are impossible to play, and I really wish they weren't. I might make a separate video on this at another point, but Sony has a real big problem when it comes to legacy. They don't give a single shit about legacy if it doesn't make them money. They do not care about the titles of old that helped build the foundation of what's been 30 years of PlayStation. If they did, more games would actually be included on their damn classics page for PlayStation Plus if you have the premium tier. But that page barely gets updated. You're lucky to see more than 10 games get added to it in 2 years. I think about the edict that came down from one Jim Ryan a handful of years ago that was leaked out to the press. A decree, if you will, that all first-party developers were to shift their focuses on their games and IPs to include somewhat of a live service element, a phrase that is poison to gamers, because it essentially tells them that your purchase of said game is not so much ownership, but an investment for an idea of a game that will launch incomplete with the hope of trickling more content in for more money, and one whose odds are not exactly in your favor to actually see the light of day. Because of course, someone who is vastly out of touch with the gaming world would say such a thing, because all they're looking at is the bottom line. This generates the most money when the successful ones break through, but the investment to create that is vast. And you're tasking developers, multiple developers from different studios who have no experience creating those kind of games, and then asking them to do such a thing while also fighting for resources? You know what you get when you do something like this? A disaster like Marvel's Avengers. You get a cancellation like Naughty Dog's The Last of Us multiplayer component. You get unhappy partners, spoiler alert here, in Marvel, who view the project as potentially damaging to the brand and character, like Spider-Man, The Great Web, because it isn't up to snuff. But you have these titles like Starhawk and Killzone with the foundation that is already there for this sort of thing, because they've had DLC packs, they have the customization, they have the infrastructure to have this be possible. Killzone is another one that has all of these elements in place, but they'd rather waste their money on remastering The Last of Us for the 17th billionth time than actually taking a look at the franchises and the communities and the fan bases of old, which deserve a second chance, giving it a breath of new life after being gone and dormant for a decade plus, testing the waters to see if maybe a revival of these franchises can be a thing, and reestablishing the multiplayer scene on PlayStation that's been dead for years at this point. But why invest in all these esports scenes if you're not gonna do anything with them? But you can also not just release these games on PlayStation platforms again. With PlayStation's move to PC games now, you could also cross that over into that scene, growing the audience and exposure for these titles even more. But that will require effort. Effort that Sony is all too eager to spend on trying to block Microsoft's acquisition of Activision, because Call of Duty is such a big and popular game that they need not to do any of those other games as long as they can keep that title on their platform, which is why you can't tell me the entire purpose of their fussing about that whole situation was about that. I'm gonna end this rant with just this. Starhawk deserved better. And maybe one day, when Sony is truly desperate, they might realize that. But I don't have hope. I miss the game so much, and I miss the community, and I miss the memories that I had playing it. And I would give anything to go back to that time, and to have another game that tried to be different like Starhawk.